Okay. So what we're going to be doing is building on these basic ideas of, again, I talked about the flow of the blood, which is, in liters per minute. And sometimes we'll be talking about flow in terms of kind of more local flow just in a particular region, or sometimes we'll be talking about the overall flow through the whole cardiovascular system, in which case it will be cardiac output, which is basically the liters per minute, out of either ventricle. So like when we're talking about the whole system, we'll be talking about cardiac output as the flow. Resistance to flow is going to be the other big thing that will, another big thing that will be coming in. And obviously resistance, we talked about what are things that can affect resistance to flow.
Viscosity of the blood.
Yeah, so viscosity can affect resistance. The more viscous, the harder it is to move the blood through the vessels.
The total length of vessels.
Total length. We talked about how that is at the core of why you need a much higher pressure on the systemic circuit, because you just have so much more length of vessels to get to every part of the body, as opposed to the pulmonary circuit where you're just going to the lungs, coming back. Right, so you end up having 3 to 5 times the amount of resistance, and therefore you need that much more pressure, because we talked about cardiac output has to be balanced, right? The flow on the systemic and pulmonary circuits has to be the same, or else you end up with congestive heart failure. But the pressure on either side is very different because of the increased resistance on the systemic circuit. And then the other part here, obviously, is the pressure. And blood pressure is basically the force that is keeping the flow moving. And sometimes we'll be talking about, again, pressure more locally. When we're talking about the pressure, like in the whole system, kind of like when we're talking about cardiac output as the flow for the whole system, when we're talking about the whole system blood pressure, we'll often be talking about mean arterial pressure. Which we will talk about in more detail in a few moments. Maybe I'll just introduce just some of the basic blood pressure concepts before we get deeper into the control of blood pressure, because it's also going to be at the core of our lab later this morning. So blooper. That's a blooper. Blood pressure. Okay. Right, so here I'm drawing the systemic circuit. Obviously, there's the pulmonary circuit on the right side of the heart as well. Maybe I could just draw that briefly. So this is kind of the pulmonary and systemic circuits here. And again, pressure is what is keeping the blood flowing. But when you think about the heart as a pump, it's really different from a pump that's like running a fountain or running your washing machine or whatever, because it pulses. Like the ventricles squeeze during systole, So there's obviously a pressure that's being generated when the cardiac muscle is actually squeezing. And that pressure, in fact, I can kind of draw a little thing here, like blood pressure. And blood pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. And maybe I'll do a quick little aside. This is our typical pressure, the units we use for pressure, millimeters of mercury. It's a very literal kind of thing. If we were in lab, I would just show you an old school sphygmomanometer. It's literally, there's like a tube filled with mercury. Liquid, it's a liquid metal. It's the stuff that's in the old thermometers. And if we have some pressure here, that pressure can push this mercury up against gravity. So if I say I have 120 millimeters of mercury of pressure, it literally is how much pressure do you need to keep a column of mercury up 120 millimeters? So if you're trying to think about like why is that such a weird unit, it really is actually a literal measurement of that much pressure will be enough pressure to support a column of mercury against gravity that many millimeters up. So but for the purposes of our class, we'll mainly just be using it as our unit for pressure, millimeters of mercury. So if I'm doing some graph of blood pressure during systole, like maybe I'll do a little heart here. This is like the heart is pumping. Obviously, pressure will be pretty high because not during the isovolumetric contraction, but once you hit ventricular ejection and the blood is pushing out into the arteries, the pressure is going to be high because the ventricles are squeezing and pushing. So that makes sense. But then you've got diastole, and you saw from your last lab that diastole actually lasts longer than systole even. And during diastole, the ventricles are refilling. The ventricles are just completely just not pushing at all. They're relaxed and refilling, waiting for the next round. But obviously your blood pressure doesn't drop to zero. It's not like the blood is going and then stops and is going and it stops. So what we need to talk about is what is happening to your blood pressure during diastole. And what's happening is it still is going on, but now instead of being driven by the squeezing of the ventricles, it's actually going to be driven by kind of the elasticity of these large arteries leaving the heart. So when we think about like the aorta, which is the main artery leaving the heart going into systemic circulation, or we think about the pulmonary trunk, which is this main artery that's leaving the heart going into the pulmonary circulation. Both of these are what we call elastic arteries, meaning that they have a lot of elastic tissue in their wall. They're really super stretchy. So think of them as like these really big, thick rubber hoses. And this, I don't know if it's the same for you guys when you were a kid, but when I was a kid, we had these toys, we called them they were called water weenies. Basically, you had this kind of length of, you have like kind of surgical tubing, and you'd hook them up to a faucet. Yes. And you could fill them with water. So they would kind of get all filled up with water under pressure. So this is just kind of this rubber, kind of rubber tubing. And then this is under pressure, but you kind of hold the end here, and then you can let go of the end and then squirt your friends. You know, it was kind of on a sunny day. It was just when a way to play on a sunny day with water. You would take this rubber tubing, you'd fill it at a hose. So it's all stretched out and filled with water when now it's under pressure because this rubber hose is pushing down on it. And then when you let it go, the elasticity of this tube recompressing is now creating pressure that squirts the water out. So I don't know if this is something you did as a little kid. If not, hopefully this kind of intuitive feel that, oh yeah, if you fill this kind of thick rubber tube up with water and it's all stretched out, when you let the water out, it's gonna now continue generating pressure to keep propelling the flow. And this is basically what's happening with your major arteries leaving your heart. When you're in systole, you're actually stretching out the major arteries, the aorta, the pulmonary trunk. The walls are stretching out. So during systole here, you've got the aorta stretching out. And then during diastole, rather than having the pressure drop to zero because the ventricles aren't pushing anymore, you actually have that elasticity of the large arteries keeps the blood pressure from dropping to zero. It's going to go down a bit. It's going to drop, but it's not going to go to zero because this is due to elasticity of those large arteries. So this is what we call my diastolic pressure, as opposed to the systolic pressure, which is due to the ventricles or due to the ventricular contraction. So when the heart is beating in systole, you've got pressure generated by the heart muscle. During diastole, the pressure drops, but it doesn't drop to zero. It stays pretty high because the elasticity of the large arteries are compressing and keeping the pressure up. Typical values, I mean, it's different for different people, but values that are, ballpark would be like maybe 120 millimeters of mercury at the peak during systole, maybe dropping down to about 180, not 180, dropping down to about 80 during diastole, and then the heart beats again. And now it's going to go back up. So we go back up into systole, and then it'll come back down. So, if I'm looking at blood pressure, so when the heart is, and let's make this like 120, let's make this 80. When we are in systole, the pressure goes up. During diastole, it starts dropping down, but then systole happens, it comes back up, and then diastole happens, and it's coming back down, and systole happens, and it goes back up. So your blood pressure is constantly kind of riding this wave to this peak during systole, to the trough during diastole. That's why your blood pressure is always written as two numbers. Usually you write it as the diastolic pressure over the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure. So you usually have two numbers when you denote a blood pressure. There's a few mathematical combinations that we use a lot. One is this difference between the systolic and diastolic. This is called the pulse pressure. And that's basically, it's called pulse pressure because that's basically what's generating that difference that you're feeling. When you feel a pulse, you're feeling it going from that floor, the diastolic, pushing up to the systolic, dropping back down to diastolic, pushing up to systolic, dropping back down to diastolic. That difference, that pulse pressure, is what's generating that differential in force that you're feeling when you're trying to take somebody's pulse. So they call it the pulse pressure. And then the other thing that I mentioned was that idea of M.A.P, mean arterial pressure. Sometimes we want to just have one number that we can use. It just makes life easier when you're trying to talk about someone's blood pressure. And instead of having to keep tracking two different things, if you want one number, kind of just an average blood pressure, instead of having to track two numbers, you can get this mean arterial pressure, but it's not going to be just an average because, as we saw, systole is shorter than diastole. So the mean arterial pressure is actually closer to diastolic than systolic, and it's actually a third of the way up. So when we talk about mean arterial, this is so messy. Mean arterial pressure. It's going to be diastolic plus 1/3 of systolic minus diastolic, which this is also pulse pressure. So if you think about it in terms of what I was just drawing here, the blood pressure is going up and down. It's basically this level, right? It's basically 1/3 of the pulse pressure up above the diastolic. Diastolic plus 1/3 of this distance up here. And again, the reason why it's not just the average of the two is because you actually spend more time on the lower, closer to the diastolic, because diastole lasts longer than systole. So we'll use mean arterial pressure as a way to refer to the basic blood pressure in the body. When we're talking about overall control of blood pressure, we'll talk about blood pressure as mean arterial pressure. When we're talking about overall blood flow in the cardiovascular system, we'll be talking about cardiac output. But again, mean arterial pressure is just 1/3 of the distance up here. It's 1/3 of this pulse pressure plus the diastolic. So any questions about this kind of core idea of what we mean by systolic or diastolic, or why diastolic exists? Again, diastolic pressure exists because of that elasticity of those large arteries. Like these large, and when we're in systole, the aorta is enlarging because of that pressure. During diastole, it's now collapsing back down and compressing, and that's what's keeping the pressure from dropping to zero, keeping us at our diastolic pressure. And then this will also kind of come back to what I was talking about in that cardiac cycle about those two phases of ventricular contraction. So now if we here's the heart, here's the ventricle, Here's the aorta. And remember, what were the two main valves that were involved with this cardiac cycle here?
AV valve, or yeah, AV valve
AV valve
and semilunar.
Semilunar.
and the semilunar. And again, the AV valves were the like mitral or bicuspid and the tricuspid on this side. The semilunar valves here. So when systole starts, when ventricular systole starts, we already have the diastolic pressure on this side, on the systemic side here, or on the other side. So the diastolic pressure pushing, which means when ventricular systole begins and the ventricles start squeezing, they have to overcome the diastolic pressure before any blood can actually leave. So that's what we call that isovolumetric contraction. That is when the ventricles are squeezing but have not yet overcome diastolic, which is pushing back. And so nothing's coming up. Isovolumetric, meaning the ventricle is not changing size, the same volume. You know, it's like once you overcome diastolic pressure, then you get that ventricular ejection. That's when the semilunar valves swing open and the blood can actually go off into the arteries. And now my blood pressure is going to be going up because I'm going to be heading up towards systolic pressure. So that all makes sense. Again, we're going to be looking at this in a more practical way when we get to the lab later and talk about ways to actually measure it, you know, without actually sticking, you know, sensors within people's arteries and stuff. But this is kind of the basic idea of blood pressure. There's one other important thing that we should talk about blood pressure. So I'm going to do a very simplified version. Let's just do one circuit here. You know, this is basically a closed system. Right? You've got the blood is sitting in this closed system of vessels and the heart. So there's a certain volume that fits in that closed system. And it turns out that your blood volume is a core, in fact, it is the main long-term control of your overall blood pressure. Because if you think about it, if you don't have enough blood, enough volume for this closed system, everything's going to be kind of flaccid. You're going to have to do a lot of messing around, constricting things, trying to keep the blood pressure up. If you have too much blood for this certain closed system, it's always going to be pushing out. Things are going to be overinflated, and you're going to have trouble. You know, the blood pressure is always going to be too high because there's just extra volume for the given amount of, or extra blood for the given amount of potential volume in there. So blood volume this is going to be our main long-term control of blood pressure. Let me So I'm putting this in like big exclamation marks. This is something that is going to be important as we go later on and to see ways that we control blood pressure. So actually the urinary system, the kidneys that are, usually think of your kidneys as getting rid of waste, you're peeing out and things like that. Your kidneys are actually the main things that are helping doing long-term control of your blood pressure by adjusting your water balance and hence your blood volume. So when we get into long-term control of blood pressure, it's ultimately going to be by talking to the kidneys and saying, retain water or let go of water. When we talk about the drugs that people use to treat hypertension, treat high blood pressure, a major class of drugs are diuretics. Things that make you pee more are going to be important for trying to lower your resting blood pressure, because if you lower the overall blood volume, you will be lowering the overall blood pressure because of this idea here. So in addition to these other things that we've been talking about, you definitely want to think about blood volume and water balance as a key player in control of blood pressure. So, okay. I think we've got those ideas. So now we're going to bring this back. So if we're thinking about overall, so let's think about our mean arterial pressure. Again, this is just, like I said, the average blood pressure in your arteries there. And then what was the formula? What did we say were the two fundamental things that control your pressure?
Is it systole over diastole?
No, that is the pressure. But we want to talk about what are the things that influence that pressure that will, there was a formula, a relationship that we introduced last class that's critical to everything we're going to do.
The pressure equals flow times resistance.
Exactly. So pressure equals flow. And again, since we're talking about overall pressure, the flow is going to be the cardiac output. Times the resistance. So in order to think about ways your body controls blood pressure, we have to look at each of these in more detail. So I should say resistance we've already looked at in quite a bit of detail. What are things that influence resistance? We just talked about it when we started this morning. Distance, the length of vessels, viscosity, but there's one other super important one that's actually more important to our discussion right now. What's one of the main ways you influence resistance moment to moment in the vessels?
Diameter.
So by adjusting, vasoconstriction and dilation, that's going to be taking the resistance up and down, right? So if I need, like, part of short-term control of blood pressure is just constrict the vessel. If you constrict the major arteries, that's going to increase the resistance and that's going to increase the pressure. There's a direct relationship between resistance and pressure here, assuming that the flow is staying constant. If you need to bring it down, dilation is going to decrease resistance, decrease the pressure. So a big part of blood pressure control is going to, particularly the short-term blood pressure control, is going to be vasoconstriction and vasodilation. The other thing that we need to look at in more detail is cardiac output, things that affect the flow coming out of the ventricles. And this we do need to look at in more detail right now. So cardiac output. Cardiac output can be further broken down into what we call stroke volume. Actually, let me go to another page. So I'm going to stroke volume. So stroke volume is similar to cardiac output, but is actually just for a single beat. This is the volume of blood, ejected by either ventricle in a single beat. Right, so however much blood is ejected when the ventricles squeeze in systole. So then the relationship between cardiac output and stroke volume is going to be pretty straightforward. Remember, cardiac output was liters per minute. This is going to be liters per beat. So if I know the stroke volume, I know how many liters per beat, but I actually want to know the cardiac output, the liters per minute. How am I going to get that?
Find out the beats per minute.
Yeah, exactly. Right, this is just going to be stroke volume times your heart rate. Right, so if I have liters per beat, the beats will go, and this is just going to give me liters per minute. So cardiac output is just this, whatever the stroke volume is, however much blood is ejected for each beat times your heart rate. And then we're going to drill down even farther and look at the things that influence stroke volume. Because each of these things are going to be things we can adjust to adjust blood pressure. Because again, cardiac output is directly proportional to blood pressure. So by adjusting cardiac output, you're adjusting blood pressure. By adjusting your heart rate, then means you're adjusting blood pressure. By adjusting stroke volume, again, it also means you're adjusting blood pressure. So that's why we need to kind of keep track of each of these things individually, because they ultimately feed back into the big picture of adjusting your blood pressure. So let's look at stroke volume in more detail. Stroke volume is going to be further broken down, what we call end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So what these mean, so this is stroke volume equals this. End diastolic volume means how much blood is in the ventricle at the end of diastole, as the beat is about to begin. Right? So diastole is when the ventricles are refilling. End diastolic volume is what is the volume in there just as systole begins. Then we get systole, the heart ventricles squeeze. It never squeezes out the very last drops of blood. There's some residual blood left in the ventricle when systole is done. So that is end systolic volume, is how much blood is left in the ventricle after the squeezing is done. So that means the amount that actually was ejected was how much was there when we started to squeeze, how much is still left over when we're done squeezing. That difference is the stroke volume. That's the amount that got ejected during that beat. Right? Does that make sense? Yes? Right, so this is going to give us even more things we can play with, because now by adjusting end systolic volume or end diastolic volume, we're adjusting stroke volume. And by adjusting stroke volume, we're adjusting cardiac output. And by adjusting cardiac output, we're ultimately adjusting our blood pressure. So let's talk about each of these pieces and how they actually can be adjusted. So again, here, my mean arterial pressure is going to be cardiac output times resistance. Resistance we've kind of talked about. But cardiac output now we've just talked about is going to be stroke volume times heart rate. So by having heart rate go up or down, my cardiac output is going to go up or down, which can adjust my blood pressure. And heart rate is pretty straightforward. We don't got to talk much more about that. That's going to be sympathetic or parasympathetic stimulation to either speed up or slow down your heart. Just how many beats per minute. Stroke volume, however, we're going to have to go deeper into. Stroke volume, we just said, is going to be end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So if we want to adjust stroke volume, we can do two things. If we want to increase stroke volume, we can either increase this or decrease that, right? If you have more blood to start at the beat, there'll probably be more blood coming out by the end. If you squeeze harder and more blood gets squeezed out by the end of the systolic contraction, you'll also have increased this stroke volume. So if I want this to go up, I can either put this up or put this down. So let's talk about how that works. So can increase the end diastolic volume by increasing what we call venous return. So let's talk about what that means. Again, this is this idea of this kind of closed system. You've got your heart, and you're sending the blood out to the body. And you have the veins coming back. And in general, we're going to talk about, the veins have much lower pressure than the arteries. Most of the time, the majority of the blood volume is in the venous side. There's less volume in the in the arterial side. So if we kind of look at where is the blood distributed in the cardiovascular system, there's a lot more in the veins, kind of slowly making their way back to the heart, and less in the arterial side. However, there is smooth muscle in the veins. The veins can compress and can increase the amount of blood that's actually returning to the heart, kind of shifting more of the volume onto the arterial side versus the venous side. That's what we mean by increased venous return. So you have kind of this constriction of the veins to force more blood onto the arterial side. So that means the heart is all of a sudden getting more blood coming back to it than it might have otherwise if the veins had stayed more relaxed. So that would increase stroke volume and would help increase blood pressure. This brings up this idea of the FRANK-STARLING law of the heart, which I might as well just throw in right now. The FRANK-STARLING law of the heart basically says that the heart will pump out all the blood that is returned to it. And again, it's two guys. So it's two. One guy's Dr. Frank and another Dr. Starling. It's not like, because I used to think it was just some dude named Frank Starling. But this is going to be due to those properties of cardiac muscle that I was talking about. If you remember, cardiac muscle has an increased contractile force if it's been pre-stretched. So if I'm returning more blood to the heart and stretching out the ventricles more because I've got this increased venous return, when I trigger the cardiac muscle to squeeze, it's going to squeeze even harder and it's going to get all that blood out. So the reason this works just has to do with the intrinsic properties of cardiac muscle. If the cardiac muscle is more stretched out because you filled it more to start with, it's going to squeeze even harder to push that blood out of the heart. So that's this Frank-Starling law of the heart. The other quality of cardiac muscle that we talked about that's going to be involved here is I talked about how you can actually have graded contractile strength. Like the cardiac muscle will actually squeeze harder, for instance, if you have epinephrine, the adrenaline around. Adrenaline actually binds to receptors and changes the amount of calcium that comes in during the contraction of the cardiac muscle and increases the strength. So if we kind of go back to my picture here. So I was saying we can increase end diastolic volume by increasing venous return. I can also decrease my end systolic volume. Let me write it out. For instance, by releasing epinephrine. Epinephrine increases the contractile strength of the ventricles. So if I have adrenaline in my body, then the ventricles are squeezing harder. If they squeeze harder, more blood is going to get squeezed out by the end of systole, so I'll have less left over. I'll have a lower end systolic volume. Does that make sense? So like I talked about, diuretics are prescribed for high blood pressure because they lower blood volume. Another really common really common drug that is prescribed for high blood pressure are beta blockers. Let me so beta blockers, they're basically beta adrenergic antagonists. Why would a drug that is basically blocking adrenaline going to help keep our blood pressure down?
Is it because it keeps your heart rate down?
So one thing is right here, it's going to keep your heart rate down. Right? Remember, adrenaline, that's going to be sympathetic. That's speeding up your heart. So by blocking that, keeping the heart rate down, that is keeping cardiac output down, is helping keep your pressure down. So that is going to be one important mechanism that beta blockers are helping keep your blood pressure down. What's another way from just what I've been mentioning right here?
Doesn't let the end systolic volume to decrease.
Yeah, by making sure we don't have that increased strength due to the adrenaline means we keep the end systolic volume like at a higher level, which keeps this from going up, which is going to keep our blood pressure down, right? So by inhibiting that increased contractile strength, that's keeping our stroke volume down. By keeping the by keeping the heart rate down, both of these, keeping heart rate down, keeping stroke volume down, keeps the cardiac output down, keeps the blood pressure down. So over the weekend, you should probably be starting to just make sense of this crazy map of it all. Once you kind of start laying it out, it all makes sense. It's all very logical, but you just have to kind of understand how all these different things relate and how they influence each other. In your book, I'll show you a little later, there's a really nice picture of how all these different things interrelate to keep your control your mean arterial pressure. So any questions like this page right here? This is important. It's important that each of these green things make sense to you, right? These two things here are important because they influence this. These and this are important because they influence this. This and this are important because ultimately that is, so each of these things are ultimately all affecting your blood pressure. So affecting any of these pieces is ultimately ways to get at controlling blood pressure. These are all things that your body is going to play with, or that the drugs that we give people to control blood pressure are going to try to influence. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about stroke volume and about end systolic and end diastolic. I'm trying to erase. Okay. So when we are talking about end systolic and end diastolic volume, let's talk about what are they kind of at rest. So at rest, a typical end diastolic volume is like maybe 135 mils. End systolic volume is typically about 65 mils. Which means, what is a typical stroke volume?
$70 per beat.
70 milliliters per beat. So when you're at rest, like right now, sitting in front of your Zoom screen, every time your right or left ventricle squeezes, about 70 mils of blood is getting splooshed out into your aorta and your pulmonary trunk. So then, if we want to think about what is resting cardiac output, that's just going to be stroke volume times heart rate. 70 mils per beat times, a typical, for you dudes who are kind of young and in shape, is you probably have a lower heart rate, but the heart rate people usually use as an average heart rate is 70 beats per minute. Which means what? What is a typical cardiac output at rest? right? If I have 70, so 70 mils is actually 0.07 liters per beat times 70. Actually, let's just leave it as mils because it'll be easier here. Boop, boop. 70 mils per beat times 70 beats per minute. Beats go away. Again, what's 70 times 70?
1400.
What's 7 times 7?
49.
So 49 and then the 2 zeros. Right? And so let's just, round it up. That's 5 liters per minute. This is kind of a typical cardiac output at rest, is about 5 liters per minute. Right? That should make sense. The math is pretty straightforward here. But then, like I mentioned, you can adjust that cardiac output. Again, you can adjust that cardiac output by increasing the beats per minute, right? Their heart rate. If you increase your heart rate, this is going to go up. You can increase this cardiac output by either increasing end systolic volume or increasing end diastolic volume or decreasing end systolic volume. So you can bring either the stroke volume up or the heart rate up. It turns out you can increase by 4 to 5 times just by manipulating either your stroke volume or your heart rate. So they call this the cardiac reserve. It can go up to 7 in like well-conditioned athletes. It can go up to 7 times. If you think about what that means, 5 times 7, that's 35 liters of blood per minute coming out of either ventricle, right? A liter is, right? It's like, a liter. This is a liter. It's a lot. It's big. Even when you're at rest, 5 liters per minute coming out of your heart, pushing out into either systemic or pulmonary circuit. When you're really working hard, you get 5 times this, maybe 25 of these. Like again, this well-conditioned athlete, 35 liters every minute getting pushed by the heart. It's kind of crazy and impressive if you think about it. So cardiac reserve is that ability to increase the flow dramatically if you need to increase the flow. For instance, we're going to talk about the flow to different parts of your body, like in your muscles. Like right now, your muscles are only opening up maybe 10% of the capillary beds that are available in them because they don't need a lot of oxygen right now because you're just sitting on your butt watching Zoom. But if you were like really doing stuff, you would have these capillary beds open up and you could increase the perfusion like 10 times into your muscles. So they're going to have way more oxygen and glucose and whatever else they need, which means you're going to really have to increase the flow and the amount of blood going off into everything. And again, your heart can do it, increasing your heart rate, increasing the stroke volume to supply your tissues with what they need. So again, that's something we'll also be seeing more explicitly when we look at our lab later this morning. So, all right. So cardiac output, we've talked about a lot of the basic things that are controlling blood pressure. So what I'm going to do now is kind of just talk a little more explicitly about control of blood pressure. And we're going to talk about short-term controls, long-term controls. So long-term control of blood pressure is pretty much always going to be about volume, blood volume. Like I said, the blood volume is basically the main kind of set point of your blood pressure. Most of the other things like speeding or slowing down your heart, or increasing or decreasing stroke volume, or vasoconstriction, vasodilation for increasing or decreasing resistance, that's going to be these kind of temporary things to kind of adjust it in the moment. But, you know, you don't want to have your heart speeding up forever to keep your pressure up or something. You know, so the main long-term set point of where is just the resting blood pressure, that's ultimately going to be about blood volume. And we're going to see in particular the renin-angiotensin mechanism and stuff that are helping adjust blood volume and things like that in a little bit. Short term, there's going to be neural mechanisms. And there's going to be kind of chemical controls. And you're also going to find out that these often overlap. You know, we're going to talk about the renin-angiotensin in quite a bit of detail in a few moments. And renin-angiotensin mechanism is going to accomplish both short-term and long-term blood pressure control. But again, short-term is when you have things that are happening in the moment, like speeding up or slowing down the heart, or vasoconstriction or vasodilation that are going to adjust the heart rate, adjust the blood pressure in the moment through those relationships we were talking about. Long-term is going to be more about adjusting your blood volume, which is more your resting blood pressure. So neural mechanisms. One of the main neural mechanisms is what we call the baroreceptor reflex. So baroreceptor. Baro is pressure. So pressure receptors. These are basically stretch receptors in some of your major arteries. And like, you know, carotid artery, aorta. So you have these stretch receptors that are basically pressure receptors, right? If there's more pressure, the artery is more stretched out. Less pressure, it's less stretched out. So by monitoring the stretch of these major arteries, you get a readout on the pressure in the artery. You know, if blood pressure drops, what are some of the things your nervous system, that we're talking about neural mechanisms now, what are the things your nervous system can do in the moment to try to bring your blood pressure back up?
constrict the blood vessels?
Totally. Vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction, if you constrict some of these major arteries that are kind of supplying things, assuming that the cardiac output is staying constant, that's going to jack up your pressure. People talk about vasomotor. This is just the smooth muscle in the vessel walls. And it's operated by the sympathetic nervous system. We talked about that when we were talking about ways that sympathetic and parasympathetic aren't totally always working against each other. This is primarily sympathetic control. There's smooth muscle in all of your blood vessels, but it's not about helping push the blood. The smooth muscle in your blood vessels is about adjusting diameter. So that's important to remember. The only thing that's really driving the pressure for blood flow is either the squeezing of the heart, the ventricles, or later when we get into the veins, there's going to be different things, but it's never going to be the smooth muscle. The smooth muscle in the vessel walls is just about adjusting diameter. So we can do vasoconstriction. What's another way we can bring blood pressure up? Actually using the sympathetic nervous system. Yeah.
Can we do it chemically, like releasing epinephrine?
But we're still in the neural mechanisms.
Oh, okay.
Right. What else does the sympathetic nervous system do here that might bring our blood pressure up? So we just said it can bring resistance up by vasoconstriction. What other thing does this? What's like the main thing? If someone said like, what's the sympathetic? What's fight or flight? What happens in your body when you activate fight or flight?
Your heart rate.
Your heart rate goes up. Sympathetic increases heart rate, right? And that's going to increase cardiac output. That's going to also bring up the pressure, right? So part of this baroreceptor reflex is going to increase resistance by vasoconstriction as well as increasing heart rate, which increases cardiac output. Both of those are going to bring the blood pressure up. Like a classic example of this, there's this thing people talk about, orthostatic hypotension. Hypo meaning lower. So if you're just kind of hanging out, you're taking a nap, your brain is here, your heart is here. You don't need as much pressure to get the blood to your heart because you're not fighting gravity. And now all of a sudden you stand up. Now all of a sudden your heart's down here and your brain's up here. And now it's like, oh my God, we gotta push a lot harder to fight gravity to make sure the blood keeps going up to the brain. Or else you're gonna pass out. You'll experience syncope. So within a fraction of a second, when you go from being horizontal to being vertical, so this is called orthostatic meaning being straight, hypotension meaning the blood pressure is too low now. Within a fraction of a second of going from horizontal to vertical, your heart rate is going to speed up and you're going to have like your carotid arteries constricting to make sure that you have adequate pressure to keep the blood reaching your brain so you don't pass out. Um, as people get older and older, their reflexes get slower, and it's much more common for like an elderly person to get up too fast and go all of a sudden, whoa, got a head rush, because that reflex isn't happening as quickly, and there's that moment where the brain is not getting enough blood. So this is an example of that baroreceptor reflex. You get up quickly, the little baroreceptors say, whoa, not enough pressure right now. So then the sympathetic nervous system goes to work and does what it needs to do to bring the blood pressure up so you don't fall on your face. The main chemical control, there are a variety of things. The one I'm going to focus on right now is called the renin-angiotensin mechanism. So let's focus on that right now. So this starts in the kidneys. So, anything that has to do with kidneys is renal, like, oh, it's an acute renal failure. Oh, no. Or the renal organ. So this is going to affect, and we're going to talk about the kidneys in way more detail later on, but you'll see that kidney function depends critically on having adequate blood pressure. Like if you do not have adequate mean arterial pressure, your kidneys will stop working. You don't have the filtration happening and all that. So the kidneys are monitoring your blood pressure, and the kidneys release this signaling, they release renin if your blood pressure is dropping. So this is where it's all going to start. Kidney release this renin if your blood pressure is going down. Again, we'll meet renin again when we get to the urinary system. It's being released ultimately in the juxtaglomerular apparatus, and we'll see more detail about it. But for right now, let's just do a little more like kind of step back and realize, okay, kidneys are noticing blood pressure drop, and now renin is being released. So what does renin do? There's a whole cascade of events. So in your plasma, you have your blood plasma, there's all sorts of different plasma proteins that are just hanging out, waiting for their moment to do something. We saw in the blood lab, there was like fibrinogen that gets turned into fibrin. Another thing that is just floating around is this stuff called angiotensinogen. So this is just a plasma protein. And assuming nothing else is happening, angiotensinogen is just kind of floating around. But renin is going to catalyze angiotensinogen into this thing called angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 is not yet our active thing. Angiotensin 1 is going to get converted into angiotensin 2. And this is going to be catalyzed by something called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. ACE is found primarily in the lungs. So basically, as the blood is going through the lungs, there are these enzymes that are anchored in there that are converting this angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. You have probably, if you've been reading anything about what's been going on in the world for the last year, ACE probably sounds familiar, not because of blood pressure, but because of COVID, right? This is where the coronavirus actually, the spike proteins actually recognize this. It's not this initial version, but one of the versions of this angiotensin converting enzyme to actually grab on and enter the cells. So, unfortunately, ACE is been in the news not because of blood pressure control, but because it's the way that coronavirus spike protein actually gets in your cells and gives you COVID-19. So, but let's stay focused on pressure right now. All right, so far I've just showed you this kind of cascade of events. Basically, kidneys see blood pressure going down, release renin. Renin catalyzes the conversion of this plasma protein angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which then gets converted into angiotensin 2 by this enzyme that's just anchored there in the lungs. So angiotensin 2 has now appeared. This is the one that we care about. So blood pressure is dropping, angiotensin 2 has appeared. Let's see what angiotensin 2 does to try to bring our blood pressure back up. So angiotensin 2, one thing is it's a potent vasoconstrictor. So how will that help with low blood pressure?
It'll increase resistance.
It's going to increase resistance, which is going to increase blood pressure, right? Back to just that basic relationship. So that would be considered a short-term control, right? Constriction, bringing up the blood pressure. But then it does a couple of other things. It causes the release of two different hormones that have important roles. Gland. So ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So this is a hormone released by the pituitary gland, and it's going to do a variety of things that are going to be important here. One thing is it's also a potent vasoconstrictor. So ADH is also going to constrict vessels, increase resistance, increase blood pressure. So more short-term control, your chemical control. But it also is going to do some other stuff. Just from its name, what is it doing? What does a diuretic do?
Prevents release of water.
Yeah, so this is going to tell the kidneys to conserve water. Antidiuretic means don't pee. So if we tell the kidneys to conserve water, this is going to keep your blood volume up. Right? So that's long-term control of blood pressure. Keeping the blood volume high is going to keep the blood pressure higher. It also triggers thirst in the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus controlled all sorts of drives, including thirst. So antidiuretic hormone is talking to your hypothalamus, and now all of a sudden, I want to drink more. And that's going to also help increase my blood volume by taking more water into my body. So both of these things, having the kidneys conserve water, being thirsty, so you want to put more water in your body, these are both going to be long-term control of blood pressure by increasing blood volume. So that's ADH. ADH, its other name is vasopressin, which makes sense when you think about it in terms of it's helping keep your blood pressure up. So AKA, also known as. So angiotensin 2, potent vasoconstrictor for short-term control, triggers release of ADH, which does both short-term as well as long-term. And then the third thing here is going to trigger the release of aldosterone by your adrenal cortex. So the adrenal gland, so far we've talked about the adrenal gland releasing epinephrine, adrenaline, but it has another part. The adrenal medulla releases the epinephrine, but the adrenal cortex releases a whole bunch of different steroid hormones, including aldosterone. This is just a steroid hormone in your body. And this tells kidneys to conserve salt. Which, if you think about osmosis, if you're saying keeping the salt in the body, that's going to keep the water in the body, which keeps your blood volume up. So in particular, having ADH and aldosterone together kind of maximizes how much water you keep in the body. So by conserving sodium, this will help increase the amount of water we keep in the body, particularly when we have ADH going on. So does that make sense? We'll meet aldosterone and ADH later again when we get to the urinary system. But for right now, it's important to understand them because they are playing this important role in this renin-angiotensin mechanism. And so this is actually going to bring us to a third major drug that's prescribed for high blood pressure, which are the ACE inhibitors. In fact, let me. What? So, different meds people take for hypertension. Like I said, there's, beta blockers, which are helping keep the heart rate low, the contractility of the heart muscle lower, therefore keeping the stroke volume, the cardiac output lower, therefore keeping blood pressure down. We talked about diuretics, making you pee more, keeping the blood volume lower, therefore keeping your blood pressure lower. And then it's going to be ACE inhibitors. Why would inhibiting ACE, again, this is that angiotensin converting enzyme, why would an ACE inhibitor be good for somebody with hypertension?
It prevents the angiotensin 1 from becoming active like angiotensin 2. So it stops all those vasoconstriction, the ADH, and the aldosterone.
Right, exactly, right? If you block the formation of angiotensin 2, you're going to stop all that stuff we just talked about. You're not going to have the vasoconstriction from the angiotensin 2 and the ADH, which are going to be jacking up the blood pressure. You're not going to have the volume increase from the ADH and the aldosterone, which increase blood pressure. So by blocking ACE, you are going to be able to stop both those short-term and long-term mechanisms from increasing, keeping the blood pressure higher. So, and it's very common for people to, again, have all of these things. They're taking, like, you see people just gobbling every morning all their different pills. These are all things that can be used in parallel to help keep blood pressure down. All right, it's 9:34, so maybe it's time to take a break. Are there any questions before we take a break? And there's a lot of stuff here, but it ultimately is all kind of logical once you sit with it and just kind of see how it all fits together. One of the things, concept mapping. Like, I know I tend to be visual when I try to organize my thoughts, trying to, like, just draw it out on a big piece of paper, all the different things that relate each other and how they all kind of entangle with each other. That might be helpful. I don't know. I do know there's lots of different moving parts here. So it does take time to kind of just lay them out and to see how they all relate to each other. And so you don't get kind of overwhelmed and confused by all of them. But again, the good thing is most of it's pretty intuitive once you start really seeing how they all interrelate with each other. Okay,